Welcome to Lives in Song, a series from Opera Rara, with me, Flora Willson, looking at the lives of composers and other musicians through their music. In this season, we're focused on the man responsible for some of the most popular music in all opera, Giacomo Puccini. He rose to fame just as the long career of Giuseppe Verdi was coming to an end, and he lived to own motorcars, use the telephone, and give the recording industry some of its earliest hits. If you haven't already done so, don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. In today's episode, I'm delighted to welcome back to the Creative Kin studio here in London, Dr. Ditlev Rindom, opera historian, Puccini specialist, and also a regular collaborator of Opera Rara. Today, he's back in the hot seat as we talk about the later years of Puccini's life and career. And as ever, of course, we've got some wonderful music for you. It's great to have you with us. Let's get going. Ditlev, welcome back to the Creative Kin studio.
Thank you, Flora. It's great to be back.
Well, in our previous episode, I was talking to soprano and Opera Rara artist ambassador Emanuele Jaho about singing Puccini's music, and that conversation took us as far as Madama Butterfly, which of course was first performed in 1904. So the big question for us today is really, what happened next? So maybe you can kick us off. What was important about what happened after that for Puccini?
Yeah, I mean, Madama Butterfly it's a really fascinating moment in Puccini's career because in a way, I think it's always tempting to want to divide composers' lives and careers up into sections. We think about Beethoven as a classic example of the early period, the middle and the late. It's more challenging in some ways with Puccini, but I think that Madama Butterfly really marks a middle point in his career, if only because at this point, he'd been producing operas with relative ease. He'd been producing works quite quickly. He always had an idea in mind for what he was going to be doing. We think about Tosca, for instance, in which he'd had the idea many, many years earlier of adapting Tosca into an opera. And then finally, he was able to do it. But what we find with Madama Butterfly is that famously, the world premiere of the work is a complete catastrophe. It's taken off the stage after only one performance, and it's reworked multiple times. And gradually, it starts to enter the repertoire, but really in quite a different form from the one that Puccini first presented. And this seems to be the starting point for him of a real crisis in his career about how he's going to go about writing operas, who he's going to work with, and how he's going to find the right subject matter for his next piece. Because if we look at his career, we see that Madame Butterfly premiered in 1904 in February. It's not until the end of 1910, 6 years later, nearly 7 years later, that La Fanciulla del West is finally premiered. So we have this enormous lag in his career in which we can see he's really struggling to work out where to go next.
Yeah, and I suppose the question of where is actually really important, isn't it? Because it's no coincidence that La Fanciulla del West is first seen at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. It's commissioned by an opera house in another country, on another continent. And that's a very long way in very literal terms for Puccini to have travelled.
Absolutely it is, and actually what we see at this point is that all the remaining operas that were premiered during Puccini's lifetime were then actually premiered abroad. So it's a real turning point in the way that he's thinking of himself and his publishers are thinking of Puccini as a really marketable composer.
Yeah, and he's a literally international star by then. His Italian operas, those earlier works, they'd already spread across the world anyway. But to actually commission a new work from Puccini, that sort of says something about a changing balance in the operatic landscape as well, I suppose, that the Metropolitan Opera in New York is beginning to take on this really important role in itself.
Absolutely, and also bear in mind at this point we have these very important opera houses outside Italy and outside Europe who have the resources to mount these very, very lavish productions for world premieres, and that really would have been an attraction for Puccini. But I think what we're really seeing at this point straight after Madama Butterfly is that he's starting to engage internationally in a new way for him in terms of promoting his own career. So he has this huge personal catastrophe in his life with the premiere of Butterfly, which from his letters you can tell bruised him absolutely horribly. His confidence was really shattered by this experience. And bear in mind, he'd had that awful car accident whilst writing Butterfly. So this was really coming off the back of what was for him a return to a full personal and professional life after this period of interruption.
Emanuele and I didn't actually talk about the car accident, so can you just fill in that little fact for us?
Absolutely. So Puccini was as you already mentioned in your introduction, a huge fan of new kinds of technologies, and he really loved driving.
Yeah, didn't he own like 3?
He did. He had multiple cars, and he was a really enthusiastic driver. He loved sailing as well, and he had a car accident in the middle of writing Madama Butterfly, which really made him bedbound for weeks, months at end. It caused huge problems for the development of the work. Obviously, it was terrible for him on a personal level. And of course, this also rolled into other personal difficulties he was having in his life and his marriage, which meant that the whole creation of Butterfly was extremely interrupted for him. So the moment when the opera's premiered, one would have imagined for him it was the relief to finally be back in the business, to have this huge premiere at La Scala for him to this hugely important opera house in Milan. And then it proved to be a complete catastrophe. There was booing. We think there was probably a claque organised to make sure the opera actually failed. But we know that this was a catastrophe for him. At this point, after he'd then premiered the revised version first in Brescia, and it was reworked a number of times, he then embarks on a series of big tours. And I think in a way for him, it was a way to slightly reset his reputation internationally as well. Obviously, it was lucrative, but also it meant that everybody understood Puccini was back in the business.
Yeah. There's that wonderful letter, I'm sure you've read it as well, him describing the first class cabin that he's been booked on a liner crossing the Atlantic to actually to go to the Americas. And he's so excited by the fact that it's this really luxurious experience and it's this high-tech ship and everything is, absolutely first class. And it's like... He's like a little boy who's been praised. He's so pleased that he gets to really revel in this experience.
Absolutely. And for someone he didn't grow up in poverty, but he wasn't from an especially rich family. And now actually as a composer, he was really enjoying a very comfortable lifestyle. And what we see then is that Puccini, he embarks on this series of international visits. And in 1905, he first goes to Argentina, he goes to Uruguay, and he presents a revised version of Edgar, which in fact has been a relative failure when it had first been presented.
That was his second opera.
It was
never
his second
really
opera.
Hit the big time.
No, exactly. And so he was invited to Argentina. There was a festival of all of his works, and Madama Butterfly was put on very successfully in 1905. And then in 1907, January, he then went to New York for another festival of his work. So Madama Butterfly was put on at the Met, Manon Lescaut was premiered, and he was really given the royal treatment by the Metropolitan Opera. And this is the point, of course, also when he first then has contact with La Fanciulla del West.
Yeah, of course. And it's so interesting to realise that the Met had been effectively cultivating an audience for his music before they actually commissioned that from him. There's another person I think we probably need to talk about at this point, and that's Enrico Caruso, the great tenor who was also, as Puccini's music was, he was so important in the early recording industry. He was the singer on some of these really early hits, the arias that everyone was listening to who had a gramophone. He was also in the cast of Fanciulla del West, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. And you think about the celebrity that he could bring to promote these works. In a way, it's strange that we don't have quite the number of recordings of Caruso singing La Fanciulla del West that we would want to have. And I think that's possibly to do with rights issues, actually. But he was a huge celebrity at this point, and famously he'd set up his career in New York rather than Italy. So he'd made that move. And this was helping to really promote the Metropolitan Opera House as the absolute global centre for Italian opera at this point in the 20th century.
And it was also, of course, it's this really interesting nexus with Puccini and Caruso and the recording industry that actually they were so closely entangled, and that where Puccini, as we were talking about right back in the first and second episodes of this series, that Puccini's publisher, Ricordi, was so important to his career. But you also get the impact of, say, the gramophone company also being important in getting Puccini out there, really creating this massive international audience for him. And we can actually hear some musical evidence of just how closely entangled composers were with the early recording industry, because we can listen now to the first song ever written explicitly for the gramophone company. It wasn't written by Puccini himself, but it was originally recorded by Enrico Caruso with Leoncavallo himself at the piano. They're not the musicians we're going to listen to now.
L'aurora di bianco vestita, già l'uscio dischiudi al gran sol, di già con le rose sue dita, carezze de fiori lo stuol, commosso d'un fremito arcano intorno al creato già par, e tu non diresti ed invano mi sto qui dolente a cantar. Metti anche tu la veste bianca e schiudi l'uscio al tuo cantore. Non sei, la luce manca, ove tu sei, nasce l'amor.
Where you are not, there is no light. Where you are, love is born. The final lines of Mattinata, Morning, a song by Puccini's contemporary, Ruggero Leoncavallo, which was composed for the Gramophone Company in 1904. It was originally released in a recording by Enrico Caruso, that world-famous tenor, but we were listening to a live performance by baritone Luis Calvetti-Pei and pianist James Southall, recorded at an Opera Rara salon concert. Ditlev, I love this stuff. It's so
Absolutely.
cheesy, it's so
fantastic.
lush, it's great. It's really strange to think it was composed the same year as Madama Butterfly, just in terms of musical language.
It is, but then bear in mind, Leoncavallo had a career as a cafe pianist, and in his life he was always interested in waltz rhythms and in creating this sort of operetta-like atmosphere in his pieces. I mean, think of Zingari. It's absolutely the world we're in, actually.
Exactly. I mean, I suppose that's what I wanted to ask is, what does this song tell us about the kind of prevailing musical tastes? Because it speaks so much of light music. It's incredibly hummable, for instance.
Absolutely, and you can see that when you look at the listings coming through at this point in the gramophone industry, there's a really fascinating combination of things that are being promoted. Of course, lots of Neapolitan songs start to be recorded by Caruso, and you can see there's a real audience for some of these pieces to be sung by opera singers. There's plenty of other kinds of popular music being recorded, but what you do find, and I think this is why both Leoncavallo and Puccini are really interesting here, is that opera clearly also mattered to these recording companies as a way to make this kind of new technology seem sophisticated, suitable for people to spend their money on, to have at home, to spend evenings listening to the gramophone. So commissioning someone like Leoncavallo to write this piece, of course, they knew that he was going to produce a great tune, it was going to be a great piece of music, but also it was great promotion for these companies to say to people, this gramophone is just as artistic and as sophisticated as the composers you would hear at the opera house.
Yeah, it's so interesting the way they're playing with those kind of, I guess, cultural registers is what we'd call it now.
Absolutely.
But opera can actually be in this grey area between popular music and very kind of high art. And the gramophone companies are actually sort of playing with that. Ditlev, Giuseppe Giacosa died in 1906. He'd been one of the two-man team, along with Luigi Illica, who had been producing all of the major libretti for Puccini since the beginning. What happened next as far as the actual texts for Puccini's operas went? Yeah,
it's a real moment of crisis. And we say, of course, Madama Butterfly, its failure was terrible for Puccini, but in a way, the death of Giacosa was a far bigger blow in certain respects, because these three men had been the three musketeers, the dream team really working together. And
not that you'd know it, the arguments they had.
No, absolutely not. But they somehow found a rhythm between the three of them that they all did bits of each other's job almost. And they worked out how to make these operas work together. They had a shared vision by the end. And I think these two men also knew how to deal with Puccini's difficulties at times. So the fact that Giacosa died, obviously, it was a huge problem. And of course, what then happens is that Puccini doesn't continue writing them with Illica. It's a complete change. And that's, at this point, then we start to see Puccini really exploring a whole series of different options for things that he might adapt, plays or short stories he was interested in. But you can see, in a way, he's full of possibilities, full of ideas, but he really struggles to settle.
Well, I was going to say he was always so fussy about his opera subjects. I mean, right back from the start, he was kind of always looking at multiple options before he then wrote the works that we know so well now. Can we generalise about what he was looking for in the subjects that he did end up picking?
To some extent. I mean, I think he was always always looking for novelty, so he never wanted to repeat himself, and you can really see that he was absolutely adamant that he didn't want to do something in the same vein as the previous works, would always had to be a definite shift. You can see he was always attracted to a range of genres, though, so he talks a lot about, for example, with Bohème, he loved the fact that it was a mixture of the tragic, but also the comic, and it was sentimental and nostalgic, and he was interested in this sort of combination, but he was very clear in his letters, for example, that he was quite drawn towards the idea of doing an opera buffa for quite a long time, long before this happened. Purely comic opera. He loved the idea of maybe doing something medieval or something that was going to be very violent. And you see, he played around with these things. There's a very important letter, actually, that he wrote in 1904 to Soldani, who was a critic, a playwright he thought about working with. And he was very, very explicit to him. It was almost sort of Puccini's artistic credo, where he said to him, you've got to understand that spoken theatre is quite different from opera in some important ways. And that's because in theatre, you can have something that goes on, it might be little details that really don't count for very much. There's so much text. But in opera, you've got to find the little things that are going to bring the drama to life. So, for example, you might see a play version of La Bohème, and with the hands touch, it might not be that important at the right beginning, but in an opera, it becomes Che gelida menina, and everything opens up. So you've got to find those little moments that open up the drama for the audience. So that was clearly crucial. I think he was also desperately looking for a particular atmosphere or colour that could really spark his imagination. It always feels like the thing that pulled him into the story was the sense of a particular place that could draw us in right from the first moments. And we see that all through his career, really, but particularly in the second half, where you only close your eyes, within 5 seconds, we know where we are somehow, which is just an amazing skill on his part.
Which was presumably the appeal of the Fanciulla del West from the David Belasco play, that it takes him to a completely new place. He's not written music about the Californian West before. What would that sound like? And yet he just conjures it.
And of course, he never actually went to California while he was doing it. In a way, the closest he got was he took that boat across the Atlantic and he saw a huge amount of empty space.
Yes.
And maybe that, in a way, sparked his imagination to think, how would you even begin to describe the ocean or that sort of empty landscape for someone?
Yeah.
But I think that always pulled him in. But I think some sort of local colour, some sort of local sounds that he could generate through music. And you can definitely see that also in the plays and the texts that he discarded, that there were things there that sparked his interest. Perhaps the idea of doing something Spanish, for instance, or something he played around with a couple of times and it never actually happened. But I think he loved the idea that he could have those dances or have that sort of scenery that would really bring the audience in.
Yeah, I mean, he did, of course, he discarded so many ideas that he did consider for quite a while, some of which were subsequently picked up by other composers. So tell us about Lodoletta, because we're going to hear a bit of this in a moment.
Yes, absolutely. So it's called The Two Little Wooden Shoes, and it's a piece that he was story he was actually interested in for quite a long time. He played around with it and then in the end discarded it, but it was taken up by Mascagni a number of years later. It was actually premiered as Lodoletta in 1917 with Rosina Storchio in the lead. But the story, essentially, it's set in the Netherlands and it's about a woman whose father dies and she's taken in by a slightly older man, and unfortunately, it ends very tragically when she goes to Paris and discovers that he's actually with another woman there, and she then dies in the snow at the end of the opera. It's a really good story. I think that Mascagni produced a really fascinating work out of it. Of course, it would be interesting to know what Puccini might have done, whether we would have had the Dutch opera that never was.
I was going to say, what would the Netherlands have sounded like to Puccini? What a question. Well, let's hear a bit of Mascagni's opera then. Here is the heroine's closing aria. So Lodoletta, as Ditlev said, is a Dutch orphan. Her lover Flamen is an artist, but they inhabit very different social worlds. In this final scene, she's dying outside his house and she sees him dancing inside with another woman.
Come son vestite,
Soprano Emanuela Jaho with the Orchestra della Comunitat Valenciana, conducted by Andrea Battistoni. They were performing part of the heroine's final aria from Mascagni's 1917 opera Lodoletta. And that's a track from Emanuela's Anima Rara album on the Opera Rara label. Ditlev, there's such a beautiful scene, the kind of the delicacy, especially as Jaho sings it there, the delicacy of the soprano line versus this really robust dance that you're hearing inside. It's very sad.
It's really a really powerful scene. I mean, it's 12 minutes long. It's a really substantial death scene that Mascagni wrote. And I'm sure Puccini would have come up with something fascinating in his own right, very different, perhaps a little bit in the vein of Manon Lescaut or something, this sort of big dramatic finale. But it's fascinating too the way Mascagni plays around with having this waltz music a little bit like Matinata actually, but it's overlaid with these harmonies that tell us, something's going wrong here.
Yeah, it's not just a waltz.
We're also hearing it through her slightly sort of exhausted mind. And that, of course, then leads into this huge climax where she then collapses in the snow.
Yeah, and it happens, that Wagnerian harmonic language, it's so overwrought. But it's also, I suppose Mascagni did this as Puccini did in his own way, this very responsive orchestral music that's constantly kind of shimmering like a kaleidoscope or something in response to the emotions of the singers.
Absolutely. And in a way, actually, I think both Mascagni and Puccini were witnesses of the fact that it was very normal in spoken theatre at this time to have music. And I think so often when we listen to Puccini's music, we're often thinking about the influence that he had on cinema, all of these techniques, and the fact that we have these tremolo effects at dramatic moments, and his ability to have these musical motifs that follow characters, and at the end of the opera often we hear the music from the beginning coming back. All of these things that have become very normal in cinema now. But these were things that were used in spoken theatre. And it's fascinating in a way to track Puccini's own relationship with some of the plays he saw and to see that he actually borrowed ideas from the composers who'd written stage music and thought, that works. We need something like that if I'm going to make this into an opera.
Yes. Yeah. And just before we move on, Mascagni and Puccini had known each other very early on, hadn't they? When Puccini was just making his way in Milan, Mascagni was at the Conservatoire as well. Did they keep in touch? I realise I don't know.
Yes, they did keep in touch. For example, we know that when they were both working on Fanciulla and Isabeau, which was Mascagni's Argentine premiere, done more or less at the same time, they were in contact. They were both very secretive about it. And in a way, this became a bit of a sore point in the Italian press that their two big composers were both premiering works more or less at the same time, and they were both being done very, very far away.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. As in fact, not quite so far away, but as Puccini's next opera was destined to be, because in 1913, he begins a commission for another opera house. Tell us about that.
Yes, so at this point, after the premiere of Fanciulla, La Rondine comes along, and Puccini had actually, again, been in a moment of uncertainty, exploring different ideas. Again, he'd been thinking about the idea of doing maybe a romantic comedy. He'd been thinking about this idea of having an evening made up of 3 short operas already after finishing Butterfly. So this idea was at the back of his mind.
So we'll hear more about that later.
We'll hear more about that. But then he happens to be in Vienna, and he is given an offer he couldn't refuse financially, which was to write an operetta for the Operetta house in Vienna. And he delayed a little bit and was very clear he wouldn't do it unless he had a lot of control over the subject matter. But then in March 1914, it's announced he's agreed to do it. He's going to be writing this operetta, which will be premiered in German in Vienna and then eventually presented back in Italy in Italian. And this becomes La Rondine.
And it's worth saying, this was the big moment of Viennese operetta. Yes, I mean, it's a tremendously important time for that genre in that city.
Absolutely. It's absolutely enormous in Vienna. And Puccini was very aware that Franz Lehár was having an enormous career, very lucrative career. But also bear in mind that operetta was also an international phenomenon.
It was being exported everywhere.
It was everywhere, and it was hugely popular in Italy. For example, we think The Merry Widow had come to Italy in 1907. It had been a massive success. It was played hundreds of times in Milan. So I think Puccini was very aware also that public interest was starting to drift towards operetta, that there were all these new composers all of a sudden who were focusing on operetta, and that there was a new public there. In a way, people who were at times, I think, feeling slightly alienated from some of the directions that new operatic composers were going in. We think about some of the works which were being written in the 1910s, for example, which were often quite long, very abstract, medieval themes, things like Mascagni's Parisina, that there was a real audience thinking, actually, I think I want to have a really good, entertaining evening at the theatre, and I want some good numbers that I can sing at the end of a show. And I think Puccini knew this, that there was an audience for this, and that he could find a way to do it his way.
So, okay, so he's all set to write for Vienna. What happens next?
So a whole series of things unfold at this point. First of all, Puccini had agreed to write a numbers operetta in German. He quickly decided that it wasn't going to be an operetta. He wanted to do something new. He called it an opera comica. It was going to be a little bit like Massenet's Manon. So there was going to be dialogue, but it definitely wasn't an operetta as he saw it. But he started work on this and quickly realised it just wasn't going to work for him. And he decided it was going to become more of a conversation piece. So everyone would sing, but there was going to be these passages of really dialogue, sung dialogue in between the arias. And the big catastrophe that happens, of course, is that the World War starts.
Yes.
And so although Italy doesn't immediately enter, when Italy does enter, it means that the idea of premiering a work in Vienna becomes completely
on the wrong
untenable.
side. Yeah.
It's on the wrong side. The whole thing collapses. And at this point, Puccini's actually written quite a lot of it. And he does talk in a lot of his letters about, what am I doing? I've embarked on this project. Is it ever going to be performed? How am I going to finish this? And what then happens is it ends up being premiered in 1917 in Monte Carlo instead. Monte Carlo then is neutral territory, and it's premiered in Italian. So we have this opera that really started as an operetta, was going to be in German, ends up being sung in Italian, in French-speaking Monte Carlo before it makes its way around the world.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so very Puccini somehow. And of course, it's not the end of the story. Do tune in for our next episode when Ditlev and I will be talking in great detail about what happens next purely to this opera, La Rondine. We have the world expert on this particular opera with us, and we'll be going into enormous depth in all the funnest ways with Ditlev on that. But yes, absolutely, the World War breaks out. What other impacts does it have on Puccini, do you think, as a person as much as anything else? I mean, presumably it's a tremendous disruption to him.
It definitely was disruption. I don't think Puccini was necessarily an enormously political man. He did write certain numbers of music. For example, he wrote a wartime song, Morire, which ended up being adapted into an aria in a later version of La Rondine. But in terms of, obviously, musical activity within Italy, it was hugely disrupted. And one thing that also definitely happened, very unusually for Puccini, that he actually started working on two operas at the same time. So we know that he wrote La Rondine and Il Tabarro were written around the same time. And of course, then when this happens, without jumping too far ahead, we know that, of course, that Il Trittico ended up being premiered in the United States, and Puccini did not go because of the war. So this is still too uncertain at this point. So in a way, the actual possibilities he has to travel, obviously in practical terms, are hugely disrupted by this.
Yes, of course. I wonder, do you think there's an argument for hearing La Rondine as a wartime work, in its original form at least? Obviously it's first seen during the war. Can we hear the war's impact on it as he was writing in those conditions?
I'm not sure whether I necessarily hear the war that much, at least in the very earliest version of the opera. I mean, without jumping ahead, we know that this is a piece that went through a number of different iterations. And I think when we think about the journey Puccini went on from 1913, when he first thought about the piece, to then eventually 1921, when it was finished, obviously the war has happened. And I think that might actually have affected the way that he approached it by the very end of the piece. I think what we really hear in so much of this piece, though, is a deep, deep nostalgia. And this is a theme clearly that carries through so many of Puccini's works. We think it's at the heart of La Fanciulla del West, is this idea of the nostalgia of all of these miners who are so far away from home. So I think the idea of disruption, lives not quite lived out the way they might have been, is just a theme that really carried a lot of weight for him as a composer all through his life.
Yes, and thinking, taking a step back from Puccini himself for a moment, I mean, Italian opera itself is undergoing significant changes by this point, or at least the health of the tradition known as Italian opera seems to be in serious question by this second decade of the 20th century. We're well into what the scholar Alan Mallock called the autumn of Italian opera. Do you think, is there a sense that Italian opera at this point is somehow becoming incompatible with what everything else that's going on in the world, whether it's wars, for instance, or whether it's actually modernism in culture, the kind of, this brave new world, culturally speaking? Well,
I think there was a huge set of competing pressures on the composer at this time for what sort of operas they should be writing and how they could possibly square that with the public available to them in Italy and abroad. So you definitely see composers, Mascagni in a way most obviously writing in a huge range of different genres. That Mascagni also wrote operettas. He wrote one called Si, which was done a lot, very successful. But then he was also writing these pieces that were much more modernist in style, even Lodoletta in parts actually, but certainly also some of his later works where he was really trying to be as harmonically experimental as possible in a way to satisfy critics who were expecting him to be aware of the latest trends, to engage with Richard Strauss, who was, together with Puccini, the most successful opera composer in the world. We think Salome was this sensational success, was done in Italy. Gemma Bilancioni, who was the first Santuzza in Cavaliere Rusticana, sang in the Italian premiere of Salome.
Right.
So we can see these operas were important, and they became reference points for Italian composers. So there was always this question about, well, if that's what they're doing abroad, there's a need to adapt to show that we're up to that. But then, of course, there's also the risk that you actually alienate your audience at home and what people are going to the opera for. And in a way, I think that's what Operetta and a work like Rondine was actually in some way responding to, was how do we engage with contemporary trends? How do we engage with Debussy and Ravel and French music, but do it in a way that's actually meaningful within the musical history of this country?
So then I suppose the question is, what happens to Verismo itself, this musical language, this operatic language that I suppose Puccini did so much work with in the 90s and indeed 80s for that matter. What's happened to it by this point in the 19 teens?
Well, in a way, I think we have to get back to that key question of what do we mean by Verismo, which is something people have debated for a very long time, and I don't think we're going to solve it today.
No, we're probably not.
But I think to cut these things very short, I think what's interesting is that the Verismo label gets attached to all this group of composers who come through in the 1890s, to Puccini, to Mascagni, to Leoncavallo, Giordano, composers who were writing often relatively concise operas in a realist vein, broadly speaking. In a way, Puccini always has the Verismo tag, but in his early career, he wasn't necessarily known for writing pieces that were set absolutely in the Italian South, or that necessarily had an absolutely up-to-date setting all of the time. Although, strangely, Le Villi, if we think about it, it's very similar in style to something like Cavaliere Rusticana with an intermezzo in the middle that divides it into two parts. So we can see that actually was potentially quite influential. But I think all of these composers, Puccini included, started to think about what had happened to this trend by the time they got to the 1910s. And nearly all of them actually started to re-engage with this idea of writing short operas that were going to be quite violent in theme, that were going to have this very declamatory vocal style, big tremolos at the climaxes, always the orchestra coming in and reinforcing the main melody. And we can see that Puccini then wrote Il Tabarro when he really started to engage with the idea of writing a Verismo opera, but also Leoncavallo then also went back to it.
Well, exactly. I mean, you've chosen an extract from Leoncavallo's opera Zingari, which was first performed in London, in 1912, as an example of late Verismo. Tell us a little bit about this opera before we hear it.
Well, it's fascinating the way this opera actually comes about, because Leoncavallo, like Puccini, was a man who toured around and presented his works. He did conduct, unlike Puccini, but he came to London to conduct Pagliacci at London's Hippodrome. This is still going as a venue, and it was, in fact, a place where they could actually flood the arena and have boats and have all sorts of displays going on.
And they really did have horses as well.
It was also equestrian. And so Pagliacci came and Leoncavallo came and conducted Pagliacci even in an abbreviated form. It was presented by him, and he was then given a commission to come with a new piece. And so he writes Zingari, which is actually based on Pushkin. It's a piece, it's a poem that's been adapted by others, in fact. But he decided to write this piece for London in 2 acts, and it really recalls so much of the musical language of Pagliacci. It's a fantastic piece, but I think at the same time, when we listen to it, we're also aware that nearly 20 years had passed between writing these 2 works, and Leoncavallo had really listened to what other composers were doing. The orchestration is actually very sophisticated. He really uses the chorus in new ways too, all throughout this piece. So it's fascinating how he's sort of, in a way, he's going back to something he'd done 20 years earlier, but he's doing it with all the knowledge and all the experience he had acquired from writing things like Zazà.
Well, here's a taster of Leoncavallo composing for London in 1912. This is an extract from the first love duet between the opera's protagonists Fleana and Radu. Eccolo finalmente il sogno. Here's the dream at last from Zingari.
Occhi azzurri, adorata, il bosco inneggia, pur che la bocca mia sia la tua bocca, trafiggi coi tuoi sguardi, trabocca l'anima mia, che tutta in te fiamme.
part of the love duet in the first episode of Leoncavallo's opera Zingari, performed by soprano Krasimira Stoyanova and tenor Arsène Sogomonian, with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra conducted by Carlo Rizzi. And that's from the complete recording of Zingari, available on the Opera Rara label. Ditlev, it's really intense stuff, of course, but it's almost fragmentary at times. That's what's so extraordinary. It's in these very small units.
It is. And I think this is partly linked to the fact that, always in these Verismo operas, there's often an exotic element. So in this case, it's set amongst the Roma community. We're on the banks of the Danube. And so you do want this intensity as part of the genre. You have to have these quite jagged vocal lines. So you always have these big rising climaxes in Leoncavallo's music. Often you have these repeated phrases that keep on going higher and higher. That's part of it. But definitely there's a real fragmentary aspect to the way parts of it are written. And I think that both Puccini and Leoncavallo, it's partly, I think, in a sense, part of this Mascagni influence in the way they're writing, that they want this quicksilver quality in the way they're composing, that the atmosphere has to change very quickly. And that's actually what I think ultimately adds a lot of depth to the music, was that you do have this intensity, but you need a variety of emotions that come through at the same time. Speaking
of which, you've already mentioned Il Tabarro. Tell us some more about Il Trittico. Let's talk a little about this as the next, it's 3 operas, not 1, but the next operatic project that Puccini embarked on.
So, as I mentioned before, the idea of writing short operas or maybe doing an evening out of 3 pieces had really been on Puccini's mind for a very long time. He'd had this idea of writing adaptations of Gorky, the Russian writer. And this was something he'd really sort of fixated on, basically sort of 1904, 1905. He'd been playing around with the idea. And I think it was this idea of trying to write something really realist, really depicting the lives of people who are having a very, very difficult time and trying to bring to life this very, very troubled atmosphere in a way I think was obviously going to be such a contrast to something like Madama Butterfly, where you had this obvious Orientalism, but all this delicacy in the orchestral writing, so much harp and woodwind we find in Butterfly and percussion. And I think he wanted a total change of tone to think, let's lean into the double basses for a bit, I think. So he played around with this idea, and then it sort of drifted away for a bit. And eventually then it comes back. And what then happens within Trittico is that unusually we have these 3 works together. They always presented, more or less always, in one evening. Sometimes we have one of them on their own, paired up. But this was the way Puccini premiered them, was the 3 operas together, but they don't have the same librettists. So fascinatingly, what we have is Giuseppe Adami writes the libretto for Il Tabarro. He was also the librettist for La Rondine, but then a new librettist comes along for these other 2 operas, for Suor Angelica and for Gianni Schicchi. And this is Gioacchino Forzano, who actually builds up a very, very successful relationship with Puccini, and crucially, he's not writing them based on pre-existing plays. So it's actually something quite different here, that when we actually start to pick apart Il Trittico as a set of 3 pieces, in a way they look very unified. People have often thought about them as depicting hell and then purgatory and heaven, because you have this change of mood across the pieces, that we start on something so miserable and sad, then Suor Angelica, which is so painful, but then also quite consoling in a way at the end, and the pure comedy of Gianni Schicchi. But then when we actually look at them, we realise, of course, that actually they have different writers, they have different sorts of sources. Gianni Schicchi is obviously based on Dante in some ways. So there's actually a total variety of different materials that are brought together to create this amazing spectacle for us.
But once again, as you sort of already hinted at, there's something peculiarly modern about the brevity, this idea that you're kind of encapsulating pure comedy in less than an hour, and then you're going to do pure tragedy. And, it's
absolutely.
that.
And there's such a European trend at this time for writing these sort of short pieces. In a way, most obviously, Richard Strauss, Salome, Electra, these were the big modernist masterpieces that went around the world, that set the standard for what you could pack into 90 minutes. And in a way, it's funny that we think about these Verismo operas by Mascagni, Leoncavallo, which have sometimes been dismissed by critics, but in a way, they were there 20 years earlier. They thought, yep, you can pack all of its intensity into 70 minutes of pure energy in a way that might be exhausting if you had to do it for 4 hours, but you can actually capture a particular atmosphere, a particular relationship very, very quickly. And so I think that's this real trend obviously drew Puccini in, but we think about how many composers were actually doing it, that there was this idea that you could, Ravel was made some of the same things, Zemlinsky. And I think, in a way, if we take a broader picture, you can even see with writers at the time, the idea of modernist writers writing short stories was a huge trend. And I think part of it was a sense that you have this absolute intensity within a short operatic form, but also there's a kind of an openness. You're always left with more questions at the end, that you're given a story, but you can never know everything in 90 minutes. You're always left wondering what more happens to these people's lives at the end.
Yeah. And so interesting and telling, of course, that what Puccini did next was not more of the same. It wasn't another very short opera. His final opera, Turandot, was on a much grander scale again.
Absolutely. And again, absolute sort of contrast that he turns to Cologozzi this time and decides he wants to write a real fairy tale opera with an 18th century source. And again, he has a different group of librettists. Again, it becomes Giuseppe Adami, but then also Renato Simoni, who was a very well-known critic in Italy at this time, who worked on this together. And we see, I think, in a way that once that relationship with Illica and Giacosa wasn't sustainable anymore once Giacosa died, Puccini needed to find new collaborators for each project. It was always about working out who to work with. And I think, in a way, he was bruised by the experience of Fanciulla, where he was set up essentially with Carlo Zangarini, and this was really hard for Puccini to work with this particular librettist. They had to enlist a second person to help him, and Puccini was very active in actually formulating the libretto from the Belasco play. And I think at this point he thought, no, never again. He created a masterpiece, but he needed to find the right collaborators for each project. And so he definitely wanted a total change when it came to Turandot, but also in terms of the sound world, most obviously, he was experimenting with things that to us in some ways really sound very modernist. We think about Turandot as this big spectacle for, a Rinda Verona or something. It's obviously on an enormous scale, but so much of it actually sounds very avant-garde when you listen to it bar by bar.
Well, I was going to say, and it's not only a comparison with, say, Strauss and his operas, but you can also think, well, by the time Puccini was composing Turandot, Stravinsky had written The Rite of Spring, and Schoenberg had written Pierrot Lunaire, and, serialism was on its way. That the musical world was changing around him, and it's not that Puccini was going to write 12-tone music, but there's something else happening in Turandot, I think, isn't there?
Absolutely. And, I think when we think about his use of percussion, which is always a very distinctive factor, and we can trace back through all of his works, but I think particularly from Butterfly onwards, that he's fascinated about how to use percussion. He really brings this to the fore in Turandot, that he obviously loves the gongs, he wants all the possible effects, he wants to have to try writing this music that obviously is Orientalist in style, but there's also, I think for him, it was an opportunity to really expand his harmonic language as far as possible, to think about how you might use repetition in new kinds of ways to create this musical drama. And I think when we actually listen to Turandot, it's amazing that it's the opera that generated Puccini's most famous piece, Nessun Dorma, the one that we all know first of all.
From the football, if
and
nowhere
in a way,
else.
it stands out because it's really very different from so much of what else we hear in this particular opera.
Yes, yeah. Perhaps worth saying that there is some controversy as to how we actually say the name of this opera. Puccini himself said Turandot, I think with
so,
a very
yes.
short O. I know that Puccini fans in the US often say Turandot today, which is also not Turandot. We in the UK tend to say Turandot. But I mean, as far as I understand it, it's a Persian name for a Chinese princess.
Yes.
Written by an Italian or a team of Italians. It's so very Puccini in its kind of cosmopolitan mangling of everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what an interesting piece. Alas, Turandot brings us, of course, to the very end of Puccini's life. Famously, he didn't actually finish writing this opera. He never made it to the end of the score. He was very unwell by the time he was actually writing the last bits and pieces that he did work on here, wasn't he? Tell us a little bit about what was happening.
Yes, so Puccini really throughout the last year of his life started to struggle with extreme throat pain. And this was eventually diagnosed as throat cancer. So
but he never knew, did he? I don't think he was ever told that the diagnosis was cancer.
No.
Those around him
and so
were aware.
he was in Brussels for experimental radiotherapy, which actually in some ways seemed to have been relatively successful, but he then died of a heart attack and leaving the last part of Turandot unfinished. So he was obviously dealing with huge personal struggles at this time, but we also know that the process of finishing Turandot as an opera was a real challenge for him. And this was clear, I think, even from the beginning when he was working through the drama, as he was trying to understand how to write this piece. he knew that the conclusion was going to be difficult because the whole opera rests on this transformation of Turandot's personality. And so that's why the character of Liu was inserted in the first place, that he wanted to have this person who embodied all of the conventional traits of femininity that the audience were going to expect in one of his operas, someone who was going to be extremely loving towards Calaf right from the start, and that the presence of Liu and then Liu's death would be one of the things that would shift Turandot, that she would see the depth of suffering and love, and then that Calaf would kiss her, and this would bring about the transformation. Now, of course, for us, we might really find this very difficult to watch in certain respects, but dramatically, I think Puccini really found this very difficult to work out. How do you make the audience believe in this change? And in a way, I think the fact that Liu has so much sympathy for so many modern listeners, in a way proved a real stumbling block for him, because we have such a painful moment in the opera and then the mood needs to move on. So we can see that he struggled to work out how to finish this, and he left sketches which were then completed by Franco Fano after Puccini died. And we know famously at the end of these sketches he wrote Poi Tristano, then Tristan and Isolde. He imagined this huge love duet right at the end that was going to resolve all of these issues, but in a way, unfortunately, we will never know exactly what he would have written.
No, it is one of the great tragedies, isn't it? And it's one of the great tragedies of being a Puccini scholar. You, presumably like me, must have read the final letters that he wrote while he was in that hospital bed in Brussels, and they're heartbreaking reading. He talks, the reason I find them so sad anyway, is he's so hopeful. He's clearly scared, but he really hopes that this treatment might work so that he can get on with his work, so that he can get back to life and living. And it's this horrible feeling. We know what happened next. You know, there is the final letter. And you get this real sense with Puccini. He's got so much personality in his letters that it's very, very sad reading every time.
Absolutely. And I think, as ever, one of the luxuries of Puccini's letters, which in some ways can not give you the information you necessarily want if you're an opera historian and you're desperate to know about some of the details of his rehearsals or his scores, but they give you such an insight into him as a man. And I think what they really reveal is the vulnerability he had and the uncertainty. I think he was always promoted in the Italian media as someone who was very stereotypically a man of his time, was very suave and very confident. But particularly, for example, after the premiere of Butterfly, you can just see his confidence collapsing, that how he had to find a way forward from this awful experience, and also in a way learn something from it, that, you know, he was criticised, but then he actually did radically rewrite the opera afterwards. And I think he knew something had gone wrong in the relationship between his work and the public. And although he was absolutely sensitive to what was happening in the musical world around him, he still wanted to move people. That was crucial. He wanted the public to feel the emotion behind the works.
Well, that's almost it for today's episode, but Ditlev will be back with me for the final episode in this series to talk more about Puccini's legacy and to reveal all about his vital behind-the-scenes work to make Opera Rara's new recording of La Rondine possible. For today, though, we couldn't leave you without our regular Ask Opera Rara segment. So, as always, if you'd like to get in touch with a query, no matter how large or small, please do email us at ask@opera-rara.com or use the hashtag AskOperaRara on our social channels. And do follow us on social media to see and learn more about Opera Rara's work. The links are in the show notes, and we love to hear from you and do respond to every single message, so do get in touch. So for today, Ditlev, we have a question from Catherine on X, who asks, what can the theatre of our time learn from Puccini? And vice versa, what did Puccini learn from the theatre of his time? This is a great question. So, what can the theatre of our time learn from Puccini first? I mean, Puccini was a phenomenal man of the theatre. It's a great cliche of writing about him, but his instincts were amazing. I always think his pacing was remarkable. He really knew how to create drama for an audience and how to hold you captive, how to manipulate you even, and then how to chuck you out the other end, feeling absolutely overwhelmed. So I think that might be my answer, but what do you think?
Well, I think one of the things that the theatre today can learn from Puccini is that Puccini was actually incredibly fearless when it came to experimenting with new media that were available to him. I mean, we don't always notice it, for example, but the ending of La Fanciulla, Act 1, he invented a new instrument to be played off stage. He was fascinated by things like photography and so made sure the production of La Fanciulla was really going to recreate the feel of the original Belasco stage production. And in a way, I think if Puccini were writing now, he would be absolutely exploring everything that new forms of digital media could do to make productions come alive. He'd be playing with offstage sound in ways we couldn't even begin to imagine. So I think that when a way Puccini's lesson to us is you can maintain the sense of absorption and excitement that audiences feel about the theatre and the emotion that they're going for, whilst actually being incredibly experimental and using everything that's available around you to tell the story.
It's horrifying, really, isn't it, to think that Puccini would have been up there with, playing with AI right from the start.
I think he might have been, yeah.
I think wreaking absolute havoc. The other side of Catherine's question, what did Puccini learn from the theatre of his time? This is also really interesting. I mean, he was a theatre goer, wasn't he? He went to a lot of spoken drama. That's how he encountered the play that would underpin Tosca, of course. He clearly was capable of being moved by plays even when he couldn't understand the language they were being performed in. So I suppose, again, it catered in some ways to his feeling for drama. He was clearly interested in acting in certain respects and new trends in a kind of very over-the-top but supposedly realist mode of acting. But I don't know, do other things strike you about this, that what else he might have picked up from the kind of contemporary theatre world?
Yes, I mean, I think the choice of plays he was drawn to changed quite a bit over the course of his career. So, of course, we think about the very beginning, things like Tosca, it was still working with Sardou, the idea of the well-made play, things that had to have very clear climaxes in each act, a very clear structure. And then Belasco becomes this very important figure for two operas that are actually then based on Belasco, and this idea of deep realism taken as far as possible. Belasco famously introduced real cooking smells into his plays on stage. This idea that you would be as absorbed as possible so that you'd have offstage sounds. Of course he would. That would bring you can have nightingales on the play that would draw you in. I think in a slightly more practical way, one of the things that Puccini really took was this thing about the music used in the plays. And this is true certainly in terms of the composers who wrote stage music, but even things like the use of songs within plays that he then took into his operas. So we see this in La Fanciulla, that we're going to have an on-stage song sung right at the beginning, and this is something he decided to repeat. That with Il Tabaro, we have offstage music, we have organ music, and this is also something he experienced when he saw the play in Paris. So he was always sensitive to actually theatre for him already when he went to these shows usually had music in it. And it was about how do you go about translating that experience meaningfully into opera and how do you make that work?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Catherine, for that question. That's great. Opera Rara's Instagram followers would like to know, Ditlev, what else are you working on at the moment? So, what have you got?
Well, my main project right now, I'm putting the final touches to my book, actually,
Very
which
exciting.
is going to be out in July. So I'm really doing the very final little tweaks to it. And that will be published by Cambridge University Press in July. So this book is partly focusing on Puccini, and it's looking about the circulation of Italian opera between Italy and the Americas in the late 19th, early 20th century, and how it relates to ideas of Italianness.
Okay, what's the title? Go on, give it to us.
It is called Opera, Italianità and Transatlantic Exchange, In Search of Italy. So if you're looking for Italy, this book is going to help you find it, I hope.
Fantastic. In Search of Italy, in search of Ditlev's
It's a B-Decker guide.
Fantastic. So something to look up next time you're in front of a computer. Ditlev, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That is it for this episode. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for all your insights into Puccini's life and music. Thank you to everyone watching or listening to this episode. Links to all of the music featured in today's episode will be featured in our show notes on Opera Rara's website, and that is, of course, opera-rara.com. I'm Flora Willson, and my guest today was Ditlev Rindom. Lives in Song is produced for Opera Rara by Creative Kin. To find out more, visit creativekin.co.uk/song. Special thanks to our producer, Jason Caffrey. This show's executive producer is Zachary Vanderberg. Our audio engineer is Phoebe Murdoch, and our videographer is Robin Barrage. Lives in Song is brought to you by Opera Rara and by the generosity of listeners like you. Opera Rara is all about uncovering and sharing the hidden gems of the operatic world, giving new life to music that deserves to be heard. Your generosity helps us share rare operas and songs with audiences around the world. If you love discovery as much as we do, you can help us keep the music alive by visiting opera-rara.com/support and making a donation. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.